The restaurant stood on a bright corner of the city, surrounded by tall glass buildings and busy streets filled with expensive cars. Every evening the place came alive with soft lights, quiet music, and the low sound of conversations between people dressed in elegant clothes. Business leaders, investors, and wealthy visitors often chose this restaurant when they wanted a peaceful place to talk, celebrate deals, or impress important guests. Inside, everything looked polished and perfect. The floor shined under warm lights, the tables were carefully arranged with white cloth and silver cutlery, and a beautiful black grand piano stood near the center of the room. It was not always used, but it gave the restaurant a touch of class. Sometimes professional musicians were invited to play during special events, but on most nights the piano simply waited in silence. Among the staff moving quickly between the tables was a young waitress who had been working there for almost 2 years. She was known for being calm and polite, even during the busiest hours. While some workers rushed through their shifts, she moved carefully, making sure every customer felt respected. Many guests barely noticed her. To them, she was simply another server bringing food and drinks. But the restaurant manager appreciated her quiet dedication. She rarely complained. She arrived early for every shift, and she treated everyone with kindness. Her life outside the restaurant was simple. She lived in a small apartment not far from the city center. The place was modest, with only a few pieces of furniture and a small window that looked down at a narrow street. It was not a glamorous life, but it was enough for her. She had learned long ago that life did not always follow the plans people imagine when they are young. When she was a child, her home was filled with music. Her father loved the piano more than anything else. He worked long hours during the day, but in the evenings he would sit at an old upright piano placed in the corner of their small living room. The instrument was worn and slightly out of tune, but it was precious to him. He believed music had a special power. He often told his daughter that a piano could speak even when words failed. Some nights he played joyful melodies that filled the house with energy. Other nights the music sounded slow and thoughtful, as if the keys were sharing quiet memories. From a very young age, she sat beside him and watched his hands move across the keyboard. At first she simply listened. Later he began teaching her small melodies. Her fingers were tiny and sometimes missed the keys, but she tried again and again. Her father was patient. He never rushed her. Little by little she learned how each key created a different sound. She learned how soft notes could feel gentle and how stronger ones could carry deep emotion. Practicing became part of her daily life. Years passed, and the music slowly became a shared language between them. Her father was never rich, but he saved enough money to buy a better piano when she turned 12. It was not brand new, but it was beautiful to her. She spent hours practicing after school while her father listened proudly from a chair nearby. He always believed she had a special talent. But life can change without warning. One winter her father became seriously ill. At first the family thought he would recover quickly, but the sickness grew worse. Medical bills became difficult to manage, and the peaceful life they once had slowly turned into a time of worry and uncertainty. During those months the piano was played less and less. Eventually the day came when the house felt painfully quiet. The music that once filled the rooms disappeared completely. After that loss, everything changed. Without her father's income, the family struggled to keep up with daily expenses. The piano lessons stopped. Some belongings had to be sold, and the beautiful instrument that meant so much to them was eventually taken away to help pay the bills. For a long time she avoided thinking about music. It reminded her too much of the person she missed. As the years passed, she focused on working and helping support her family. Dreams that once felt important slowly moved into the background. Survival became the priority. When she finally moved to the city to find work, the restaurant job was the first stable opportunity she found. At first, the long hours were exhausting. The pace of the restaurant was fast, and wealthy customers sometimes spoke harshly to the staff. But she stayed patient. She reminded herself that every job had challenges, and she needed the income. The restaurant manager eventually noticed her effort and gave her more responsibilities. She learned how to handle large tables, how to remember complex orders, and how to keep calm even when guests became demanding. Despite the busy environment, there were moments when she felt a quiet connection to something familiar. Those moments happened late at night. After the last customers left and the chairs were being placed on top of tables, the restaurant became silent. The bright lights were dimmed, and only a few workers remained to clean the dining area. Near the center of the room stood the grand piano. For many months she walked past it without paying attention. But one evening curiosity pulled her closer. The black surface reflected the soft lights above it, and the keys looked almost untouched. She hesitated before sitting down. It had been years since she played. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard for a moment. She wondered if she had forgotten everything. Slowly she pressed a single key. The sound echoed gently through the empty restaurant. Something inside her stirred immediately. A memory, a feeling she had not experienced in a long time. She tried another note, then another. Soon a simple melody began to form. It was not perfect at first, but the rhythm slowly returned to her hands. Her fingers remembered more than she expected. A few minutes passed before she realized someone was standing nearby. The night manager had paused his cleaning to listen. He looked surprised but impressed. When she finished, she quickly stood up, slightly embarrassed. She explained that she used to play when she was younger and only wanted to try the piano for a moment. The manager smiled and told her the music sounded wonderful. But she asked him for a small favor. She didn't want customers to know about it. Playing music was something personal to her, not something she wanted attention for. She simply enjoyed the peaceful moment after work. The manager respected her request. From that night on, whenever her shift ended and the restaurant was empty, she sometimes sat at the piano again. The melodies grew stronger each week as her confidence slowly returned. Those quiet performances became her private escape from the busy world around her. None of the wealthy guests who filled the restaurant every evening knew that the quiet waitress serving their meals carried a hidden talent. To them she was invisible, just another worker moving quietly between tables. But everything was about to change. One evening, as the restaurant prepared for another busy night, a group of extremely important guests made a reservation. The manager quickly informed the staff that a powerful billionaire businessman would be arriving with several associates to celebrate a major business deal. The atmosphere in the restaurant immediately became more serious. Tables were rearranged, the best wine was prepared, and every worker was reminded to provide perfect service. Customers like that could bring attention and reputation to the restaurant. As the evening approached, luxury cars began stopping outside the entrance. Inside, the staff prepared carefully. Among them was the same quiet waitress, carrying menus and arranging glasses on a large table near the center of the room. Not far from that table, the grand piano stood silently under the soft lights. Neither she nor anyone else in the restaurant could have guessed that before the night ended. The music from that piano would change everything. The evening slowly grew busier as more guests arrived at the restaurant. The warm lights reflected on polished tables, and the quiet sound of conversations filled the air. Waiters and waitresses moved carefully through the dining area, balancing trays of drinks and plates of food, while soft music played in the background. The staff already knew that an important group of guests would arrive that night. The manager had reminded everyone several times to be extra careful and professional. Customers like these were not ordinary visitors. They were powerful business people whose opinions could influence the reputation of the restaurant. Around 8 o'clock, several expensive black cars stopped outside the entrance. The glass doors opened, and a group of well-dressed men walked inside. Their presence immediately caught the attention of many people in the restaurant. At the center of the group was the billionaire everyone had been talking about. He was known in the city as one of the most successful business figures in the region. His companies owned large hotels, technology firms, and investment groups. Newspapers often wrote about his deals and business decisions. Many people admired his success, while others said he had become too proud because of his wealth. That night he looked confident and relaxed. A tailored suit fit him perfectly, and he walked with the calm attitude of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. The manager greeted him warmly and personally led the group to their reserved table near the center of the restaurant. It was one of the best spots in the dining area, offering a clear view of the room and the stage where the grand piano stood. As soon as they sat down, the group began talking loudly and laughing. It was clear they were celebrating something important. Their conversation moved quickly between business stories, jokes, and plans for future deals. The quiet waitress was assigned to their table. She approached with a calm smile, holding a notepad and pen. Even though she had served many demanding customers before, she could feel the pressure in the air around this group. The manager had trusted her with the table because she was known for staying polite in difficult situations. She greeted them politely and began taking their orders. The billionaire barely looked at the menu. He ordered expensive wine for the entire table and several of the most costly dishes on the restaurant's menu. His friends followed his lead, adding more food and drinks to the order. Within minutes, the table was filled with energy and loud conversation. As the waitress moved back and forth bringing drinks and appetizers, she noticed that the billionaire enjoyed being the center of attention. He told stories about business deals, luxury trips, and famous people he had met. His friends listened with interest and sometimes laughed loudly at his jokes. Several times during the evening he spoke to the staff in a casual but slightly dismissive way, as if he expected everyone to serve him without question. Still, the waitress remained calm and professional. She delivered each dish carefully and made sure the table had everything they needed. Across the room, other guests quietly enjoyed their meals, occasionally glancing at the energetic group celebrating near the piano. The night continued like this for nearly an hour. More drinks arrived, and the voices at the table became louder. The group appeared relaxed and confident, enjoying their success and the luxury around them. At one point, one of the men at the table looked toward the grand piano standing near the stage. "Strange that such a beautiful piano is just sitting there," he said while holding his glass. "You would think someone would be playing it tonight." Another guest laughed. "Maybe they only bring musicians for special events." The billionaire leaned back in his chair and followed their gaze toward the piano. The instrument looked elegant under the soft lights. Its polished surface reflected the surrounding tables, and the keys seemed to invite someone to sit down and play. Then one of the guests noticed the waitress standing nearby after placing another bottle of wine on the table. He smiled playfully and pointed toward her. "Maybe she can play," he joked. The group chuckled at the idea. To them it sounded like a harmless joke during a relaxed evening. But the billionaire found the suggestion amusing. He turned slightly toward the waitress and studied her for a moment. She stood quietly, waiting to see if they needed anything else. "Tell me something," he said with a light but teasing tone. "Do you know how to play the piano?" The question caught her by surprise. For a moment she thought he was simply making conversation, but the expressions on the faces around the table showed they were expecting something entertaining. She hesitated briefly before answering. "Yes," she said softly. The table grew quiet for a second, then a few of the guests laughed again, thinking she was joking. The billionaire raised an eyebrow. "You play the piano?" he repeated, sounding slightly doubtful. She nodded politely. "I learned when I was younger." One of the men leaned forward with interest. "Well then," he said jokingly, "maybe we should hear something tonight." The group laughed again, but now several nearby tables had started paying attention to the conversation. The waitress felt the eyes of the room slowly turning toward her. The billionaire smiled, clearly entertained by the situation. "Why not?" he said casually. "It would make the evening more interesting." His friends seemed eager to see what would happen. Some expected her to become nervous and refuse. Others simply wanted a funny moment to break the routine of the celebration. For them it was only a joke. But for her, the moment felt very different. She looked toward the piano across the room. The black instrument stood quietly, exactly where it always was. For a brief moment she remembered those late nights after work when she played in the empty restaurant. Those were peaceful moments when no one was watching. This situation was the opposite. Now the restaurant was full of people. Customers were turning in their chairs, curious about what would happen next. Some of the staff paused their work, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. The billionaire leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "So," he said with a small smile, "are you going to play for us?" The tone in his voice suggested that he did not fully believe she could actually perform. It sounded more like a challenge than a request. The waitress remained quiet for a moment. She could feel the tension building around her. Saying no might disappoint the guests. Saying yes meant placing herself in the center of attention in front of dozens of strangers. She took a slow breath. Years ago, her father had told her something she never forgot. He once said that music should never be played to prove something to others. It should be played from the heart. But standing there in the busy restaurant, she realized something important. The piano was not only a memory from her past. It was still a part of her. Finally, she gave a small, calm nod. "If you would like," she said politely. The group at the table immediately reacted with interest. Some smiled, expecting a quick and awkward performance. Others leaned back in their chairs, ready to watch. The billionaire gestured toward the piano. "Please," he said. The waitress placed her notepad down on the edge of the table and slowly walked toward the center of the room. The restaurant grew quieter with every step she took. Customers turned their chairs to face the piano. Even the kitchen staff peeked through the doorway to see what was happening. She reached the bench and paused for a moment before sitting down. Her hands rested gently above the keys. For a few seconds, the entire restaurant waited in silence. Across the room, the billionaire watched with a confident smile, still expecting an amusing moment. He believed he was about to witness a simple attempt by a nervous waitress. But in just a few moments, that belief was about to change completely. For a few seconds, the entire restaurant stayed quiet. The waitress sat on the piano bench with her hands resting gently above the keys. The bright lights above the dining area reflected on the smooth black surface of the grand piano. Around her, dozens of people were watching. Some looked curious, some looked amused, and some simply waited to see what would happen next. At the large table near the center of the room, the billionaire leaned back in his chair with a relaxed expression. His friends watched with small smiles, expecting an awkward or funny moment. To them, the situation felt like light entertainment during their celebration. But for the waitress sitting at the piano, the moment felt very different. She could feel her heart beating faster than usual. It had been a long time since she had played in front of people. When she practiced late at night after work, the restaurant was always empty and peaceful. There were no eyes watching her, no pressure to perform. Tonight was the opposite. She could hear the quiet sound of dishes being placed down in the kitchen and the soft whisper of guests speaking to each other at nearby tables. Some customers had even lifted their phones slightly, ready to record whatever might happen. She slowly took a breath and looked down at the piano keys. The black and white keys looked exactly the same as they always had. For a moment she remembered the old piano that once stood in her childhood home. It had been worn and slightly faded, but it had carried thousands of melodies through the small living room. She remembered sitting beside her father while he played simple songs in the evening. He used to smile whenever she tried a new melody for the first time. Even when she made mistakes, he encouraged her to keep going. Those memories suddenly felt very close. The noise in the restaurant slowly faded from her mind. The eyes watching her became less important. All she saw now were the piano keys. Across the room, the billionaire's table waited patiently. One of the guests leaned forward, whispering something to another man. A small laugh followed, as if they were expecting the performance to end quickly. The manager stood near the bar, watching carefully. He knew the waitress had played before during quiet nights, but he had never seen her perform in front of a full restaurant. He hoped she would not feel too nervous. The waitress gently placed her fingers on the keys. For a moment she did nothing. The silence grew deeper, stretching across the room like a calm pause before something important. Then the first note sounded. It was soft and clear, echoing lightly through the dining area. The sound was simple, but it carried a quiet warmth that immediately caught people's attention. She played another note, then another. Slowly a melody began to form. At first it was gentle and careful, like someone remembering a familiar path after a long time away. Her fingers moved slowly, touching each key with patience. A few people at nearby tables leaned closer to listen. The melody grew slightly stronger. Within seconds, the music began to flow more naturally. Her hands started moving with greater confidence, sliding smoothly across the keyboard. Each note connected with the next, forming a beautiful pattern that filled the restaurant. Conversations at nearby tables began to stop. A couple who had been speaking quietly during dinner turned their chairs toward the piano. Another guest lowered his glass slowly, listening with surprise. The music was not awkward or hesitant the way many people expected. It sounded calm, emotional, and surprisingly skilled. At the billionaire's table, the expressions began to change. The confident smiles slowly disappeared. One of the men who had joked earlier raised his eyebrows in surprise. Another guest stopped whispering and focused completely on the piano. The billionaire himself sat a little straighter in his chair. The waitress continued playing. Now the melody was stronger and more confident. Her fingers moved quickly but smoothly across the keys, producing a sound that filled the entire restaurant. The piano seemed almost alive under her hands. She was no longer thinking about the people watching her. Instead, she was remembering the feeling of music itself. The rhythm felt natural, almost like breathing. Every note carried a small piece of emotion that flowed into the next. Customers from other tables began turning their chairs toward the center of the room. Even people who had arrived only a few minutes earlier could sense that something unusual was happening. The music continued to grow. What began as a soft melody slowly turned into a rich and powerful performance. The notes moved faster now, weaving together in a way that showed clear experience and control. The room had become completely silent except for the piano. Even the kitchen staff had paused their work to listen from the doorway. At the billionaire's table, no one was laughing anymore. One of the guests leaned forward with his hands resting on the table, watching the pianist closely. Another man shook his head slightly, as if he could not believe what he was hearing. The billionaire's confident expression had disappeared. He stared at the waitress with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Just a few minutes earlier, he had believed this moment would be entertaining for his friends. He expected a few simple notes or a nervous attempt that would end quickly. Instead, he was hearing music that sounded like it belonged in a concert hall. The melody changed again, moving into a deeper and more emotional section. The notes carried a feeling of reflection and quiet strength. Some guests listening nearby felt a strange calm spreading through the room. One woman at a nearby table placed her hand over her mouth in amazement. The waitress's fingers moved quickly across the keys, yet every note remained clear and controlled. It was obvious now that she had spent years learning and practicing music. But what made the performance special was not only the technical skill. There was emotion in every movement. Each part of the melody seemed to tell a small story. Sometimes the music sounded hopeful, sometimes thoughtful, and sometimes powerful. The restaurant no longer felt like a busy dining space. For those few minutes, it felt more like a quiet concert hall where every person was connected by the same sound. The billionaire slowly leaned forward in his chair. He was no longer smiling. His eyes remained fixed on the piano. For the first time that evening, he looked completely speechless. The waitress continued playing, unaware of how deeply the room had changed. She simply followed the music, letting the melody guide her hands across the keys. And with every passing moment, the realization grew stronger among the guests watching her. The quiet waitress they had barely noticed before was not just someone serving food and drinks. She was someone with a rare and beautiful talent. And the performance was far from over. The music continued to flow through the restaurant, filling every corner of the room. The waitress no longer looked nervous. Her fingers moved across the piano keys with confidence, almost as if the instrument had been waiting for her all along. At first the melody had been soft and careful, but now it was growing stronger. The notes rose and fell like a quiet conversation that slowly became more powerful. Every part of the music felt natural, as if the piano itself was telling a story. The entire restaurant had changed. Just minutes earlier, people were chatting, laughing, and enjoying their meals. Glasses clinked together and waiters moved between tables carrying trays. But now almost everyone had stopped what they were doing. Many guests had turned their chairs toward the piano. Some leaned forward with their elbows resting on the table, listening closely. Others simply sat still, letting the music fill the silence around them. Even the staff had paused for a moment. Near the bar, the manager watched with quiet amazement. He had heard the waitress play before during late nights when the restaurant was empty, but hearing the music now in a full dining room felt completely different. The sound was richer and more emotional than he remembered. In the kitchen doorway, two cooks stood side by side, quietly listening. No one wanted to interrupt the moment. At the large table near the center of the room, the billionaire and his guests were also completely silent. The laughter that had filled their table earlier in the evening had disappeared. One of the men slowly placed his glass back onto the table without taking a sip. Another guest looked toward the billionaire with a surprised expression, as if asking without words, "Did you expect this?" The billionaire himself seemed frozen in place. He had leaned forward in his chair, his eyes focused on the pianist. His earlier confidence had faded, replaced by quiet disbelief. The waitress continued playing, unaware of how deeply the music was affecting everyone around her. Her attention remained on the piano. The melody changed again, moving into a faster and more energetic section. Her fingers moved quickly across the keys, creating bright notes that danced through the air. The sound was lively and full of energy, but it still carried a smooth rhythm that kept every note connected. Several guests exchanged amazed glances. A man at a nearby table whispered to his wife, "This is incredible." She nodded slowly without looking away from the piano. The music seemed to grow larger with each passing second. It felt as though the restaurant itself had become part of the performance. The quiet clink of a fork or the soft creak of a chair blended gently into the rhythm of the piano. For the waitress, the room around her had faded into the background. As she played, memories returned one after another. She remembered the small living room from her childhood, the old piano near the window, her father sitting beside her while she practiced simple scales again and again. She could almost hear his voice encouraging her to keep playing when the music became difficult. He had always believed that music was more than just sound. He said it was a way to express feelings that could not be explained with words. Those memories filled her mind as her hands moved across the keyboard. The melody softened again, becoming slower and deeper. Each note carried a sense of calm reflection. The music seemed to breathe gently through the room, touching the emotions of the people listening. One older guest closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound surround him. A young couple sitting near the stage watched with quiet admiration. At the billionaire's table, one of the guests shook his head slightly in disbelief. "I can't believe she works here," he whispered. Another man nodded in agreement. The billionaire did not respond. He continued watching the pianist with a serious expression. For the first time that evening, he seemed completely thoughtful. Earlier in the night, he had viewed the situation as a small joke. He believed asking the waitress to play would create a moment of entertainment for his friends. In his mind, it was a harmless challenge. But now he realized something important. The person sitting at the piano was not someone who deserved to be laughed at. She was someone with real talent. The music grew stronger once again, building toward a powerful section of the piece. The waitress's fingers moved faster, yet every note remained clear and controlled. The melody climbed higher, filling the restaurant with bright and confident sound. People listening could feel the energy rising. Some guests began smiling, clearly impressed by the performance. Others leaned forward even more, completely focused on the piano. The staff standing near the walls exchanged quiet looks of amazement. The manager folded his arms and smiled softly. He knew that this moment would be remembered by everyone in the room. At the center table, the billionaire slowly sat back in his chair, still watching carefully. His earlier confidence had turned into something else entirely. Respect. He had spent many years in business meetings and luxury events, surrounded by talented people in different fields. But he had not expected to witness something like this in the middle of a restaurant dinner. The waitress was not just playing music. She was performing with emotion, discipline, and heart. The melody now reached its most powerful point. Her hands moved across the keyboard with speed and control, creating a rich sound that seemed to lift the atmosphere of the entire room. For a brief moment it felt as if time itself had slowed. No one spoke. No one moved. The restaurant remained completely silent except for the piano. Then slowly, the music began to calm again. The fast notes softened, returning to a gentle melody similar to the one that had started the performance. The rhythm slowed, and the sound became peaceful once more. It felt like the end of a long journey. The final notes floated softly through the room, lingering in the air for a few seconds before fading away. Her fingers rested quietly on the keys. For a moment she stayed still, as if letting the music finish its story. The restaurant remained silent. No one clapped yet. No one spoke. People seemed almost surprised that the performance had ended. Then suddenly, from one table near the back of the room, someone began clapping. The sound broke the silence like a spark. Within seconds more people joined in. Applause spread across the restaurant, growing louder and louder until nearly every guest was clapping. Some even stood from their chairs. The sound filled the room with energy and appreciation. The waitress slowly stood up from the piano bench, slightly surprised by the reaction. She looked around at the guests with a humble expression, clearly not expecting such attention. At the center table, the billionaire remained seated for a moment longer. He looked at his friends, then back at the pianist. Finally, he stood up as well. His hands joined the applause. But unlike the others, his expression carried a deeper meaning. The challenge he had given earlier in the evening had turned into something he never expected. Instead of creating a moment of embarrassment, he had revealed a hidden talent that left the entire room amazed. And as the applause continued around him, he realized that the evening had changed in a way he would not easily forget. The applause continued to echo through the restaurant for several long moments. Many of the guests were still standing beside their tables, clapping with genuine admiration. Some people even looked at each other with wide smiles, as if they had just witnessed something rare and unexpected. The waitress stood beside the piano, slightly overwhelmed by the attention. She had never performed in front of so many people before. Usually the only audience she had were the empty chairs and quiet walls during late nights after work. Now the entire restaurant was looking at her. She gave a small, humble smile and lowered her head slightly in thanks. She did not seem proud or dramatic. Instead, she looked almost shy, as if she hoped the moment would pass quickly so everyone could return to their meals. Slowly the applause began to settle. Guests returned to their seats, still whispering to each other about what they had just heard. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others spoke quietly about how beautiful the performance had been. Near the stage, the manager walked closer to the piano with a proud expression. He had always believed the waitress had talent, but seeing the reaction of the entire room made the moment feel even more special. Before he could say anything, someone else stood up from a nearby table. It was the billionaire. For a brief moment the room grew quiet again. Many guests noticed him walking toward the piano and watched with curiosity. His friends at the large table also looked surprised, unsure of what he planned to say. Just earlier that evening he had been the one who challenged the waitress to play. His tone back then had carried a hint of teasing, as if the situation was only meant to entertain his friends. Now the atmosphere felt completely different. The billionaire walked slowly across the dining area until he reached the piano. The waitress stood quietly beside the instrument, unsure of what he might say. For a moment he looked at the piano keys, then back at her. His expression was calm, but the confidence he showed earlier had softened. Instead of the playful smile he once had, his face now carried something closer to respect. "You play beautifully," he said in a steady voice. The words were simple, but everyone nearby could hear the sincerity behind them. The waitress thanked him politely. She did not appear angry or offended by what had happened earlier. Instead, she simply stood with the same quiet calm that had defined her throughout the evening. The billionaire paused for a moment, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I did not expect that," he admitted honestly. Some of the guests nearby smiled quietly, remembering how confident he had seemed before the performance. One of his friends from the table walked closer and spoke with a laugh. "I think none of us expected that," he said. The small group shared a light moment, but the tone was no longer mocking. Instead, it carried genuine admiration for the pianist. Several guests from other tables began approaching as well. Some thanked the waitress for the music. Others simply told her how much they enjoyed the performance. One elderly man said it reminded him of concerts he attended many years ago. A couple visiting from another city told her that the music had made their dinner unforgettable. The waitress listened politely to each person, offering a grateful smile in return. She seemed surprised that so many people cared about her performance. After a few minutes, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Guests went back to their meals, conversations restarted, and the staff resumed their work. The waitress quietly stepped away from the piano and returned to her duties. It almost looked as if nothing unusual had happened. She picked up a tray of glasses and began serving other tables again, just like she had earlier in the evening. But the atmosphere around her had changed. Many guests now looked at her with curiosity and admiration. Some whispered to each other as she passed by, remembering the powerful music they had just heard. Even the staff treated her slightly differently. One of the waiters gave her a friendly smile and whispered, "That was amazing." She simply nodded and continued working. At the large table near the center of the room, the billionaire and his friends sat quietly for a moment. The group that had been loud and playful earlier now seemed more thoughtful. One of the men lifted his glass and shook his head with a smile. "That was something special," he said. Another guest agreed. "You never know who might surprise you." The billionaire listened to the conversation without speaking. His thoughts seemed far away from the celebration that had filled the evening earlier. For years he had spent his life in powerful business meetings, surrounded by wealthy partners and successful executives. In those circles, people often judged others quickly based on their position, appearance, or job. But tonight something unexpected had challenged that habit. The person he assumed was simply a quiet waitress had revealed a talent that could fill an entire room with emotion. He leaned back in his chair and looked toward the piano again. The instrument now stood silent, as if nothing had happened. But the memory of the music still lingered in the air. One of his friends leaned toward him and spoke quietly. "You should invite her to play at one of your events," the man suggested. "People would love it." The billionaire did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued watching the waitress as she moved through the restaurant carrying plates and speaking politely with other guests. It seemed strange to him that someone capable of such beautiful music would simply return to serving tables as if the performance meant nothing. Finally he spoke. "Maybe," he said thoughtfully. But even as the conversation at the table slowly returned to normal, his attention remained on the waitress. He noticed the calm way she worked, never seeking attention or praise. She did not act like someone hoping to impress powerful people. She simply did her job. That quiet confidence impressed him more than he expected. Later in the evening, as the celebration continued and desserts were served, a few guests were still talking about the performance. Some wondered where she had learned to play like that. Others guessed that she must have studied music for many years. The waitress never offered long explanations. When someone asked, she simply said she used to play when she was younger. Nothing more. As the night moved closer to closing time, the restaurant slowly began to empty. One table after another paid their bill and left, still discussing the memorable performance they had witnessed. Eventually, the billionaire's group also prepared to leave. He stood from his chair and adjusted his jacket while the staff cleared the table. Before walking toward the exit, he paused for a moment and looked back across the room. The waitress was near the bar speaking with another customer. The piano remained silent under the soft lights. For a brief second, he considered saying something more, but instead he simply nodded to the manager, thanked the staff for the evening, and walked toward the door with his friends. Outside, the night air felt cool and quiet compared to the busy restaurant inside. As the group stepped into their cars, one of the men laughed and said the evening had turned out far more interesting than they expected. The billionaire gave a small smile. But in his mind he was still hearing the sound of the piano. And he knew this would not be the last time he thought about that performance. The restaurant slowly became quiet again after the busy evening. One by one the guests had left, and the sound of conversations faded from the dining area. The warm lights were dimmed slightly, and the staff began cleaning the tables and arranging the chairs for the next day. For the waitress, the night had felt longer than usual. Even though she had returned to her normal work after the piano performance, the memory of that moment stayed in her mind. She was not used to so much attention. Serving customers had always been simple and predictable, but standing in front of a full restaurant and playing music was something completely different. Still, she felt peaceful. As she wiped down one of the tables near the window, she could hear some of the other staff members talking quietly in the background. They were still discussing the performance. "I had no idea she could play like that," one of the waiters said. Another worker laughed softly. "Neither did I. I thought she would only play a few notes." The manager smiled as he listened to their conversation. He walked over to the waitress and spoke gently. "You gave everyone a night they will remember for a long time." She looked slightly embarrassed and thanked him quietly. To her, it had simply been music, something she had loved for most of her life. Soon the last tables were cleaned and the chairs were placed neatly on top of them. The restaurant was almost empty now, just like it was on the quiet nights when she sometimes practiced the piano. She glanced toward the grand piano in the center of the room. It looked exactly the same as it always did, calm and silent under the soft lights. For a moment she thought about sitting down and playing again, but she decided not to. The night had already been full of surprises. Instead, she finished her work and prepared to go home. Outside, the city streets were calm. A cool breeze moved through the buildings, carrying the quiet sounds of distant traffic. She walked toward her small apartment, feeling tired but thoughtful. Back inside the restaurant, the manager finished locking the doors and turning off the lights. But the story of that evening was far from over. The next morning something unexpected began to happen. A few of the guests who had been in the restaurant the night before had recorded short videos of the piano performance on their phones. Some of them shared the clips with friends, and others posted them online. At first only a small number of people watched the videos, but the music was powerful, and the story behind it made people curious. Viewers were surprised to learn that the person playing so beautifully was not a professional concert pianist, but a waitress working in a restaurant. Within a couple of days, the videos began spreading further. People shared them on different platforms, and comments appeared from strangers who admired the performance. Some said the music had moved them. Others said they loved seeing hidden talent revealed in such an unexpected way. The restaurant manager noticed the attention growing when several new customers arrived asking about the pianist. One guest even asked, "Is this the place where that piano video was recorded?" The staff looked at each other with surprised smiles. When the waitress arrived for her next shift, she had no idea that anything unusual was happening. She entered the restaurant as usual, greeting her coworkers and preparing for the evening shift. But within minutes, the manager approached her with a thoughtful expression. "I think you should see something," he said. He showed her one of the videos on his phone. At first she looked confused. Then she realized it was her performance from the other night. Thousands of people had already watched it. She felt a mixture of surprise and nervousness. She had never imagined that something so personal would be shared with so many strangers. But the comments below the video were kind and encouraging. Many people praised the music. Some wrote that they hoped she would continue playing. Others said her story reminded them that talent can exist in the most unexpected places. Over the next few days, more guests visited the restaurant, curious about the pianist they had seen online. Some asked if she would play again. At first she felt shy about the attention, but the manager encouraged her gently. "People love the music," he said. "You don't have to perform every night, but sometimes it would be nice." She thought about it carefully. Music had always been something personal, something connected to memories of her father and the quiet moments they shared. But maybe sharing it with others could also be meaningful. So one evening, after finishing her work, she sat at the piano again. This time, a small group of guests gathered nearby to listen. The performance was calm and natural, just like before. And once again the restaurant became quiet as the music filled the room. Among the people who later watched the video online was the same billionaire who had challenged her that night. He had returned to his busy schedule after the celebration dinner, attending meetings and traveling between cities. But one afternoon a colleague showed him the video that had started spreading across the internet. He recognized the restaurant immediately. As the music played through the phone speakers, he watched the performance again from beginning to end. The same feeling returned. The surprise, the respect, and the quiet realization that he had misjudged someone based only on their job. A few weeks later, he attended a charity event supporting music education for young students who could not afford instruments or lessons. The event took place in a large hall filled with guests, teachers, and supporters. Near the stage stood a piano. When the program began, one of the organizers stepped forward and introduced the evening's special guest performer. As the pianist walked onto the stage, the billionaire felt a small moment of recognition. It was the same waitress from the restaurant. The audience welcomed her warmly as she sat at the piano. When the first notes began to play, the room filled with the same beautiful sound that had once surprised an entire restaurant. The billionaire listened quietly from his seat. This time there was no challenge, no teasing, and no laughter. Only respect. As the music continued, he understood something important. Talent does not always appear in places people expect. Sometimes it waits quietly, hidden behind ordinary jobs and everyday responsibilities. And sometimes all it takes is one unexpected moment for the world to finally hear it. When the performance ended, the audience stood and applauded. The pianist smiled humbly and thanked them. In the crowd, the billionaire joined the applause. Not as someone trying to entertain his friends, but as someone who had learned a simple lesson. Never underestimate the quiet person in the room, because sometimes they are the ones with the most beautiful story to tell.